So my hierarchy would be something like this. I type letters, I type words, phrases, sentences, paragraphs. I sequence the paragraphs, I make chapters, I write books. It's all coherently laid out towards some higher order aim, all of that. And the aim is, as far as I'm concerned, to share my clinical knowledge and to educate people. And that makes sense because I'm a clinician and a researcher and a professor. And so if I was going to do that, I've decided I'm going to do that. So that's what I'm doing. And hopefully that's a good thing. And hopefully people respond to it as if it's a good thing, because then that's a good thing for me and it's a good thing for them. And so that seems to be like the very definition of a good thing. And I'm trying to set things straight, right? I'm trying to set myself straight by writing carefully. I'm trying to set the culture straight by saying what I believe to be the case. I'm trying to set other individuals straighter by communicating with them. I'm trying to ensure that we can live more harmoniously in our culture and in the world. And you think, well, those are good things to have at the outermost reaches of your value hierarchy. You know, my friend of mine was talking to me about bricklayers the other day, and he's trying to restructure a major company at the moment. And we were talking about how to motivate people. He said, well, let's say you're a bricklayer. It's like, you know, one damn brick after another. How are you going to be excited about that? Well, let's say you're a medieval bricklayer, right? And it's 1500, and you're working in one of the great early Renaissance cities in Europe. And it isn't a wall you're building, it's a cathedral. It's going to take 350 years. And why are you doing that? Well, it's for the ultimate glory of God, whatever that means. And so you're not putting one brick down after another. It's like you're involved in this unbelievably complicated moral structure that stretches all the way up to heaven itself, so to speak. And each of your minor actions, you know, your local actions, is imbued with the spirit of that entire moral structure. Well, that's a philosophy. It's like, well, do you have a meaning in life? What's the meaning of life? Well, hopefully it isn't just unrequited suffering and malevolence. We could dispense with that as much as possible. That might be a good start. But then to aim high, well, that seems to be reasonable. To aim as high as you can. And we've laid out things that could be aimed at. You could constrain yourself, you know. There are things you're not doing and things that you shouldn't be doing. You stop doing the things that you shouldn't be doing and start doing the things you should be doing. That's a good start. Wake up enough so that you can set the structures around you right. It's your moral obligation as a citizen, your responsibility, and your divine duty, I would say, from our cultural perspective, because in the West, everyone is regarded as a sovereign individual. The fate of the state, a sovereign individual on whose shoulders rests the fate and the health of the state, right? That's the fundamental presupposition. Otherwise, well, why do you get to vote? Just to make a mistake? Well, no, that's not it. You're supposed to be awake so that the ship of state continues to move forward in the appropriate direction. And somehow we've decided that's up to you. Why? Well, because we've also decided, hey, man, you can do it. And not only that, no one else can. And so that's something to know and might be something to take seriously. It's like, who knows what the hell you'd be if you got your act together. And I think you would be. Like, you'd be a force to contend with, you know. You'd have constrained the malevolence in your own soul. And you'd have started to take advantage of the potential that's around you. And to build yourself out of that potential into God only knows what, you know. And then maybe with that wisdom you can set the structures around you in order. At least more in order than they are. Or maybe to disintegrate them a bit when they need it and to restructure them so they're even better than they are. And you can push back nature in its horrible form and invite it forward in its positive form and make things better for you and for your family and for your community. And you can approach the unknown itself and you can explore that, the potential that's out there. And you can bring back the treasure that's part of the unknown potential. And you can distribute that. And that is what you can do. And then not only that, it's what you need to do, because you need to have a meaning in your life, an aim, a value structure that's of sufficient potency and magnitude to justify the limitations and the trouble that life constitutes, right? This is no trivial business that we're involved in, right? We're all in this up to our necks, literally. It's a mortal game. You're all in. And to play it wrong is to risk suffering in hell. And I'm not talking about afterlife. I'm not talking about something metaphysical. You can generate plenty of hell right here around you. Plenty. An unlimited amount. And so you can move towards that direction, or you can move towards a positive direction. And you can orient yourself. And you can learn. This is why the postmodernists are so incorrect. It's like, look, you need an aim. You need an aim. You cannot organize the way you look at the world without an aim. It's not optional. And then the question is, well, what should the aim be? Well, probably not to radically increase the amount of misery and suffering that you experience in everyone else. I mean, maybe you want to go that route, and people do, but I think they only do when they become bitter and they give up, and they make mistakes they know they're making, right? It's conscious decision to go down that route. It's not like they think that's okay to begin with. Their aim's wrong. It's like, straighten out your aim. So there's an old idea, this idea of sin. Sin is a word that was derived from a Greek word, hamartia. And hamartia is an archery term, and it means to miss the target. And so you think, well, how can you miss the target? Well, you have no weapon. Well, then you miss the target. You have no target. You have no aim. Well, then you miss the target. You don't pick up your bow. Well, then you miss the target. You don't draw it back. Then you miss the target. You don't practice and miss many times, right? Because you have to do that to develop the skill to hit the target. So you're not willing to take the risk to miss. You do none of that. And so you miss the target. And that's the sin. And then you miss your life. And then what happens around you is that, well, there's far more hell than there has to be, and there's much less heaven than there could be. And it's on you. And that's part of your, what would you say, your divine value, let's say, that sets you aside along with everyone else as something, someone, some being that even the law itself has to respect intrinsically. And that's marked out in our culture by the sovereignty that you possess and the notion that there's something in you that's made in the image of God, something that can confront the unknown and to create habitable order out of chaos and potential, and to do that properly. And that's all true as far as I can tell. And it's all necessary to know. It's coded in the deepest stories that are at the base of our culture. And we're in danger of not understanding them and not believing them. And it's a big mistake because they're heavy and profound and weighty and fundamental and necessary. Because you have to stand on something that's solid, or everything is sand and you fall in and you're done. And so is everything around you. Well, so that's, what was the name of the talk? What was the name of the talk? I don't even remember what the hell I titled it now. Part of it is, yes, the relationship between your internal psychological structure and the social world. That was part of it. And then the manner by which you estimate magnitude of error. I suppose that's the last thing I should say. You have a value hierarchy. We already described what that is, ranging from the trivial motor actions that you undertake to the highest order aims. What makes you upset? Your determination of how far up in the hierarchy the error you have made has disrupted things. So you tell your kid, you didn't put that spoon on the table quite right. And then they're a little upset, but it's whatever. You twist the spoon, it's fixed. Or you say, you're a rotten kid, and you've always been a rotten kid, and I don't see that there's much hope for you in the future. It's like, well, people do that when they argue with people they love, and they do that quite a bit. It's like they're taking them out at the highest level of their value hierarchy, right? And that makes people really upset. And the reason for that is, well, it wipes out their whole map. And so there's also a relationship, this is an interesting thing to know, between how upset you get emotionally and how important the thing that you're pursuing is that's being criticized. And it's Oh, and with a practical note, you know, if you're arguing with someone, here's something you can think about. You want them to change their behavior. The first thing you want to do is you want to sort of pat them on the head and say, you weren't horrible all the time in the past, and you're not horrible all the time now, and you probably won't be horrible all the time in the future. So we'll just get that out of the way. But there's this small thing that you do that could use a little improvement, and here's how you can improve it. And I would be satisfied and happy with that. If you tried it, would you be willing to? And then they improve incrementally, and over time, maybe if you're very careful with such things and you don't do them too often, and you also allow the other person to do that to you as well, then you get incremental improvements without chopping people off at the knees, so to speak, when you're criticizing the way that they're behaving. All right, well, how to conclude all that? You can't look at the world without an aim. Literally. You can't even perceive it. You cannot regulate your emotions without an aim. The better your aim, the more precise your aim, the more elevated your aim. You remember in Pinocchio, when Geppetto wants to turn Pinocchio into a real boy, he wishes on a star. It's a strange thing, eh? But everybody just accepts it. It's like, well, yeah, if you've got a puppet, you just made a puppet, and you want to turn it into a boy, the logical thing to do is open the window and wish on a star. Everyone knows that. It's like none of that makes the least bit of sense, obviously, except metaphorically, but we do understand it because we can watch that and it makes sense. There's something magical about it. And there is something magical about it. Because the truth of the matter is that if you want to transform something that's nothing but a wooden-headed puppet into something that's a fully functional, autonomous, moral, autonomous individual, then what you do is you elevate your eyes above the horizon to the highest point of light that you can perceive, and you aim at that. And that works. And that works for you, and it works for your partner, and it works for your children, and it works for the world. Thank you very much. There was one here I thought was quite amusing. Oh, who would win in a bare-knuckle brawl between you, Ben Shapiro, and Justin Trudeau? Well, Ben's a malevolent little creature, so so he might have some dirty tricks up his sleeve, but he doesn't have much of a reach on him. Trudeau, he can box, so he'd probably get me on technical skills, and I'm quite a bit older, but I think I'd get up a lot of times. So, well, hopefully it won't come to that. But I tell you, there is part of me that thinks it would be interesting. All right. So, and there was 137 of you who thought that one was worth discussing. So that's good. So, is the sole purpose of religious ideas to propagate the species? No, it's not the sole purpose. We discussed that a lot today. The sole purpose of religious ideas, the sole purpose, first of all, the questioner assumes that there is a sole purpose, and I don't think that that's accurate. So you want to be careful about reducing something complex to a single explanation. That's generally the purview of ideologues, right? They have one idea and it just covers the world, and the world is a little bit too complicated to be covered by one idea, unfortunately. The purpose of religious ideas, as far as I could tell, is to remind us who we are. You know, we don't live that long, right? And we're really complicated. And it's not easy to learn how to be a person. You know, I mean, it takes you like 40 years before you can learn to be a person enough so that you can get out of your mother's basement. So it's hard. That's half your life before. Well, maybe not 40, but certainly sometimes. It takes a long time to learn how to be a human being. And we're very, very complicated. We're way more complicated than we can understand. You know, and we've been watching each other for a long time, watching ourselves, telling stories about ourselves, trying to draw some wisdom from our self-observations to teach to our children and to our grandchildren and so forth. And we've codified them in all sorts of strange ways in these memorable stories, fairy tales and myths and religious stories, all of those things. And what are they there for? They're there to remind us who we are, because we need to know who we are. And, you know, we talked about that a little bit tonight. I believe the notion that, I believe the most important idea that's ever been generated is the idea that men and women are made in the image of God. I think that a culture that isn't predicated on that belief, knowingly or unknowingly, and better, knowingly, is doomed to absolute catastrophe. Because there's no reason to assume that there isn't something about us that's of transcendent value. I mean, if for no other reason than the fact of our consciousness, you know, like here we are, we're aware of what there is. And it isn't even obvious that there could be what there is if there wasn't something that's aware of it. And so our very awareness plays an integral role in the fact of being itself. You know, and metaphysics aside, it's hard to see that anything could be more vital than that, more important than that. And then it isn't only that we apprehend reality, you know, and therefore give it shape merely by our perceptions. It's also clearly the case that we partake in its shaping. And we call ourselves on that. You know that you feel guilty and ashamed when you're not doing what you could be doing, when you're not living up to your potential, when you're not making the most of what's offered to you. You understand at a very deep level that you're breaking. There's no other way of saying it. You're breaking a divine commandment. You're offered this unbelievably rich possibility, and it's there for you to grapple with. And you say, well, I don't believe in such things, that in the divinity of humanity, or in divinity itself, or in the divine for that matter. But you can't fool yourself with that kind of argumentation. It doesn't stop you from feeling guilty and ashamed and worthless and disappointed and frustrated and angry and vengeful at the fact that you're wasting your life and you're noticing it, and that you're making yourself much less than you could be, and that you're making things around you worse for everyone else. And like, perhaps there's a psychopath or two in the audience who just doesn't give a damn, and who is focused only on instantaneous gratification for their most primordial impulses this moment, right? But it's not a sustainable mode of being, and it's very rare. And so the purpose of religious ideas is to wake us up. It's to remind us who we are, right? It's to remind us that we're imbued with a spirit that can be best described in some sense as immortal. It's the spirit that allows all of us to be conscious, that we all participate in simultaneously, that gives rise to the world and shapes it. And then to alert us to the vital importance of the responsibility that goes along with that. Because I do believe that we shape the world. We move it towards heaven, or we move it towards hell. And we do that with every conscious decision we make. And it moves in the direction that we determine. And so that's what religious stories are there to remind us of. 50% of Queensland police are now required to be women. As a bloke applying, how do I speak intelligently and effectively into this situation? What percentage of Queensland police are now currently women? Is it like 20% or 10%, or does anybody know? Is it a low percentage? It's what? It's 5. Okay, so this basically means that as a bloke applying, you don't have a hope in hell, right? Which is why 200 people thought this was an important question. Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's like, what the hell are you sitting around for? It's time for some political action. There's no excuse for this whatsoever. There's no excuse whatsoever for equality. For equality of outcome measures. They're ideological to the core, and they're very oddly applied. It's like, what percentage of women are bricklayers? I know I talked about bricklayers already tonight, but it's a good example. I went on the U.S., if you go on this statistical site that's operated by the U.S. government, you can look at occupations by gender. And it's an interesting thing to do. Here's an interesting thing. You know, the most common occupation for women back in the 1950s was secretary. You know what the most common occupation for women is now? It's secretary. They don't call them secretaries now. It's usually executive assistant or something like that. And that may indicate some elevation, genuine elevation in status. But fundamentally, the most common occupation hasn't changed in, what's that, 70 years. So that's pretty interesting. Bricklayers, 99.9% of bricklayers are men. Okay, so, and then it's the same for like heavy-duty construction equipment operators and people who are working with heavy machinery tend to be men. People who are building things, especially outside, tend to be men, overwhelmingly so. Far more even than engineers, because there's a fair number of female engineers. It's like, well, what are we going to do here? It's like, we're going to enforce gender equality of outcome across the board, sex equality of outcome across the board. Is that the theory? And how are we going to do that? Exactly. Or are we going to just do it hit and miss? It's like, oh, well, it's policemen this year. Well, how about bricklayers? It's like, why don't we pass a law, like tomorrow, that now 50% of bricklayers have to be women? It doesn't bloody well matter if the women want to be bricklayers. That's irrelevant. Who says anything about want? It's like, the only reason that women don't want to be bricklayers is because they've internalized their misogyny. Right? Well, that's the standard answer for that sort of gender inequality. And where is it going to stop? So I think, I've thought for a long time that the left can go too far. And I think that if you don't think that the left can go too far, then your head is so far stuck down in the sand that I need an ending for that metaphor. I was thinking about something far ruder and just made it polite. Anyways, I guess that's the ending to it. Obviously, the left can go too far. The 20th century is a testament to that. Venezuela is a testament to that. Okay, so when does the left go too far? Because the left isn't particularly interested in answering that question. And I would say the left goes too far when they insist upon equality of outcome legislation. Now, equality of opportunity is a different thing, because I think that if you have any sense, imagine that you're just greedy, and self-centered, and that you want the most for you. So we won't be too optimistic about your motivations. And I don't think that most people are like that, by the way. I think that people are, by and large, pretty good at reciprocal interactions, and they do like to have nice things for themselves, but they're often hard on themselves. But they care about the people they love, and they care about their families, and they're pretty good at reciprocal interaction with other people too. So I don't think we are just innately selfish to the core. It doesn't work. But let's assume you are for a moment. Well, and then let's assume that there's a bunch of things you don't know how to do, and there's some people out there who have some talent that might be able to do them, and if they did them, then you'd get to benefit. Like you don't know how to make an iPhone. Well, some of you might, but not the whole thing. But, some people know how to make an iPhone, and you get to have one. And so stopping someone who could make an iPhone from making one for some arbitrary reason because of their sex or their ethnicity or their race just seems completely counterproductive. And it's pretty obvious if you look around the world, and you look at countries that are developing economically, here's one good indicator. You know, the countries that have, there's a very powerful relationship between the rights granted to women and the economic viability of a given country. It's very tightly associated. So that's quite cool, because it seems to indicate, well, maybe openness to the participation of women in traditional societies is also an indicator of openness to the new, you know, to the novel. And so that's a good predictor of economic success. Or maybe it's that women have 50% of the talent, and we could use the damn talent, so how about we invite them into play too? That seems perfectly reasonable. And the same goes for, as I said, for ethnicity and for race. And so I think you have to be a damn fool not to open up the hierarchies to those who are competent, right, to the maximal possible degree, and that it's an error not to do that. But to insist that the outcome is the same, it's like, it's vile as far as I'm concerned, for a variety of reasons. The first reason is there's no indication that any attempt to do that in the 20th century ended up in any other manner than catastrophe. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, think it through. Think it through. It's like, okay, 50% of every occupation has to be men and women. Okay, you're really willing to do that, are you? And we could start with bricklayers. It's like, how are you going to do that? You're going to start forcing girls when they're like 13 to learn to lay bricks? And how are you going to force them to do that? Because maybe they're not interested. I can tell you something that's quite interesting about the STEM fields in women. So as societies become more egalitarian, so their equality of opportunity legislation is more widespread and arguably more effective. And so that would be in countries like Australia, but more particularly in countries like the Scandinavian countries, because they've taken it farther than anywhere else. Fewer women go into the STEM fields. Fewer, not more. And so if you rank order countries by how free women are, there's a negative relationship with how probable it is that they'll go into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. Now, and the evidence for that is very, very strong, by the way. This isn't just a few casual studies. These are large-scale international studies with tens of thousands of participants, replicated multiple times by researchers who did not expect to find that, nor want it. So it's reliable. Okay, so why? Well, there's a bunch of different theories. One is that the average IQ of men and women is the same. And that's quite clear. But the male curve is flatter than the female curve. And that's the, what do they call that? The enhanced male variability hypothesis, which has almost now become impossible to publish on because it's politically incorrect. And what it suggests is that there are more men at the very upper end of the intelligence distribution and more men at the very lower end. And that explains some things, like why there are far more boys, for example, who have learning disabilities than there are girls. And there's some evidence that men are more neurologically vulnerable than women because they're more specialized neurologically. And the advantage to that is this enhanced variability, but the disadvantage is the specialization makes them less robust and resilient neurologically. Be that as it may. That's one possibility. And I think there's a fair bit of evidence for that. And it's often the case that differences at the extreme, even if there aren't differences in the middle, differences at the extreme actually make a big difference. You know, because like, let's say you're going to be an engineer. Maybe one person in 100 is an engineer. And you have to be really interested in gadgets to be an engineer. You know, you have to be more interested than 99 out of 100 people to be an engineer. And there's not that many people that are like that. And most of them happen to be men. Now, people have criticized the male variability hypothesis because they've looked at the performance of girls in mathematics in junior high school. And it turns out that girls do pretty much as well as boys do in mathematics in high school, in junior high, at the upper end. And so those would be the people you'd expect to go into the STEM fields, right? Because they have the, what would you call it? They have the intellectual ability for it. But what you see is that the women who have high mathematical ability also tend to have high verbal ability. Whereas the men that have high mathematical ability tend to have less high verbal ability. And so one of the things that implies is that the women who have high mathematical ability have more vocational choice. And so they're statistically less likely to go into the STEM fields. So that's kind of an interesting, no one expected that, so that's kind of an interesting observation. And then there's another observation too that's also extraordinarily germane. There's a variety of ways of looking at the psychological differences and similarities between men and women. And the first thing that you might want to know is that men and women are more similar than they are different on all the personality dimensions. So the overlap is quite strong. The biggest differences are, there's 5 personality dimensions. I mentioned them: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. The biggest differences are in neuroticism. Women are higher in negative emotion, and that kicks in at puberty, because it's not the case for boys and girls. And they're higher in agreeableness, which is partly why there are far more men in prison. Which is another thing we might think about. Is like, what is that? Is that gender discrimination, precisely? Now, I'm bloody well dead serious about this. I went to a NATO conference 25 years ago, and there were a group of female scientists there who claimed that the psychiatric diagnostic criteria for childhood conduct disorder should be revamped, because there were far more boys diagnosed with childhood conduct disorder than there were girls. And that's the precursor, by the way, to adult antisocial personality disorder or to criminality. And the way that you equate it by sex, if you want to do that, is you get rid of the violence. So one of the criteria for childhood conduct disorder is kicking, hitting, biting, and stealing, like criminal behavior. If you take that out of the diagnostic criteria, then you get the same number of boys and girls. And that's what they were advocating for 25 years ago. And I thought, you people are completely out of your bloody minds. Because the only reason that we ever came up with the diagnosis for childhood conduct disorder was because we were worried that the violent kids would become violent adolescents and that they would become violent adults, which is exactly what happens, by the way, because aggressive behavior is unbelievably stable and difficult to alter. But they were perfectly willing to gerrymander the diagnostic criteria so that the sex difference disappeared, even though that would completely invalidate the utility of the diagnosis. And their fundamental claim was the reason that there were more men in prison than women was because it was a form of arbitrary prejudice. And that this is absolutely insane. So, you know, it is the case, if you look at domestic violence statistics, by the way, women hit men more than men hit women, just so you know. It actually doesn't matter mostly. Not that it's pleasant, that isn't what I'm saying, is that men are a lot stronger than women. They have a lot more powerful upper bodies. And so when men hit women, the consequences tend to be very dire, and when women hit men, well, they're less dire. And I'm not saying that it's okay, but I am pointing out that, you know, this does happen. It's not the point. The point is that, you know, we're concerned about criminality because we don't want violent people attacking other people in the streets, disrupting the harmony of society, and generally corrupting the integrity of the state. And so we put them in prison. And most of them are men. It's like 10 to 15 to 1, and it's like that worldwide. Okay, what? Are we going to do? 50% are now going to be women? So seriously, look, if the theory is the only goddamn difference between men and women is a consequence of the oppressive social structure, that cuts both ways. And what that means is that if 85% or 90% of the people who are in prison are male, then the prison system is unbelievably prejudiced against men. So we're going to act on that? And how? That's easy. We lower the standards of criminal behavior for women until we equate the number of men and women who are imprisoned. Look, that's what you're going to do. Yeah, you know, you think that's funny. That's what happens in the military, especially at the higher ends, you know, in the operations like Navy SEALs or the places where there's tremendous emphasis on physical readiness. The only way you can equate by gender is to reduce the performance criteria that the women have to attain. So if you can do it there, then why the hell can't you do it for criminality? If the goal is equality of outcome, where are you going to stop? And that's easy. If the goal is equality of outcome, you stop when the outcomes are equal. And not just the desirable outcomes. You know, you hear about the fact that, well, if you look at the C-suites of major corporations, that a majority of the people are men. It's like, well, the first thing I think about that is, well, what the hell's your point? It's like, that's hardly anyone, right? 99% of men, 99.9% of men, are not on the C-suites of large corporations. So we're talking about a very tiny proportion of the population, and they're strange people, right? They are. They're not normal people. And the reason I say that is because, first of all, they're very intelligent, most of them. So that takes the first slice. And the second slice is, all they do is work. Like 80 hours a week. And not everybody wants to do that. And why should they? It's like, whoever said that you should work 80 hours a week? But if you're going to rise to that level in any profession, I don't give a damn what the profession is. If you want to hit the top 1/10 of 1% in your profession, then all you do is work. And not only do you work hard and efficiently, and you do it better than anyone else. Plus, you need the talent, and you need the intelligence, and you need the luck, and you need the health, and all the other things that might go along with that. And so the fact that a majority of them happen to be men, that says nothing about the structural, what would you call this? It says nothing about the fundamental structure of the state, as far as I'm concerned. And why are we concentrating only on the upper end? Like, why is it that it's the CEOs that count and not the bricklayers? You know, and there's all sorts of things we could talk about with regards to that. That's straightforward. Okay, so what's the difference between men and women with regards to occupation? Okay, men are way more likely to work outside. Okay, so now half the women who work outside, half the people who work outside have to be women. Men are way more likely to work in dangerous jobs. They're overwhelmingly more likely to be injured and killed on the job. It's like, okay, time to equate for that. I don't know exactly how we're going to do that. Maybe we just injure women randomly till it's equal. Or we force them to take the jobs. And I don't know how we do that. Okay, men are way more likely to move. That's another thing. They're also much more likely to work longer hours. Women are way more likely to work part-time. That's particularly true, by the way, in Scandinavia. And the reason they do that is because, well, you know, they hit their 30s, early 30s usually, and they think, especially often if they're successful, I've seen this happen with women all the time, because I worked with women in law firms, really unbelievably accomplished women, because the firms would send us their best performers, and our job was to see if we could make them a little bit more productive, because if they were high performers and they were even 5% more productive, it was unbelievably valuable for the company. And so all the law firms, they just lose all their women in their 30s. And it happens everywhere. And the reason it happens is very straightforward, and all the female lawyers know this. They won't talk about it publicly, but they all know it. They did very well in high school. Then they did very well in university. Then they did very well in law school. Then they went and articled, and they did extremely well as articling students. Then they got hired as associates and did very well, and then they made partner. And it was just like linear progression. And there wasn't a lot of questioning that went along with it, because most of the people who do that are very conscientious. So they're duty bound. And so, you know, they hit it, they have an aim, and they just execute, man, they execute. And conscientiousness, by the way, is the best predictor of success in law after intelligence. And so you have to be a conscientious person, detail-oriented. And so if you happen to be a woman like that, extraordinarily hardworking, very, very bright, you just make a beeline to partnership. But then you're 30. And that's a problem. And it's a problem for a bunch of reasons. The first is, you've hit the target, and now you're surrounded by these guys and women who are partners, and you thought that was a hell of a fine place to be. But when you get there, you find out that it's rough, it's aggressive, it's competitive, it can be nasty. And most of the people who are doing it are not happy. It's hard work. I've met lawyers who like what they're doing, but they're rare. It's very competitive, and it's very harsh. And you're going to work, man. If you're get paid $750 an hour, you're working whenever there's work to do, no matter what else you have to do. And you might be making $350,000, $400,000 a year, and that's good. But you're probably married to someone who's making approximately the same amount of money. So you actually don't need that much money. And you certainly don't need more. You might want it, but you don't need it. And then you start thinking, why the hell would anyone in their right mind do this? Which is the right question, by the way, to ask about the people who sit in the C-suites in major corporations. It's like, they're working 70, 80 hours a week for 30 or 40 years. That often they sacrifice their families for it and everything else. And they're a particular kind of person who does that, usually hyper-conscientious. But like the question, why you would do that, is a really good question. How about you have a life? How about you have a partner that you see sometime? How about you have some children that you actually get to see and take care of? And so then you think, well, maybe I don't need to work 80 hours a week to continue my rise through the upper stratosphere of the law profession. I'll pull back, I'll find an 8-hour-a-day job or a part-time job, and I'll have a family. Well, that's what's happening in Scandinavia. It's like, is that okay? Or not? And if it's not okay, what are we going to do? We're going to enforce gender equality there too, are we? They've enforced gender equality at the board level in the Scandinavian countries. It hasn't made a goddamn bit of difference to the number of women who are in management positions in Scandinavia. And the reason for that was that wasn't the problem. It wasn't systemic oppression. There's a multitude of reasons that men and women take different pathways in their careers, and they're becoming more evident. Another one is that women are different, higher in negative emotion, higher in agreeableness, about the same in conscientiousness, openness, and extroversion. There's some differences, but they're relatively minor. Pretty much the same in terms of intelligence. Doesn't look like it's an ability issue for most professions, with the exception of the extended male variability hypothesis. That might have to do with like upper-level mathematical genius, but we can leave that aside because it's debatable. There is another difference between men and women, and this is the biggest difference that psychologists have discovered, and that's of interest. Men are more interested in things on average, and women are more interested in people on average. And the difference is actually quite big. It's 1 standard deviation, which means that, it's a little more than that, which means that if you were a man as interested in people as the typical woman is interested in people, you would have to be more interested in people than 85% of men. And if you were a woman who is as interested in things as the average man is interested in things, you'd have to be more interested in things than 85% of women. So it's actually quite a big difference. And so thing interest is a big determination of interest in the STEM fields. And women just aren't that interested in things. Now, some of them are, and they go into the STEM fields, but most of them aren't. So what are you going to do about that? So, one of the things they're trying to do in the Scandinavian countries is they're going to really start to socialize boys and girls different in preschool. Okay, so that's good. So that's what you're going to allow, is it? This is the idea. You're going to discount the notion entirely that there might actually be differences between men and women, even though that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. But we're going to discount that. And we're going to assume that all the differences in outcome are a consequence of systemic oppression. And then we're going to give enough power to the state so that they're going to transform the way that our children are treated when they're 3 and 4 by teachers, by preschool teachers. And we're going to try to rejig the entire culture predicated on that theory. That's the solution. Well, if you don't think that that's a totalitarian solution, then you are not thinking. And this is the last one I'll answer. A little ornery about these questions tonight, apparently. What do you think of our state governments teaching gender fluidity concepts to primary school children? This is what I think. I think if your damn primary school teachers knew how to teach kids to read, they wouldn't have to bother teaching gender fluidity. Thank you, everyone.